Do Egyptians prefer Russians more than Americans? Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Egypt and Russia has always been friends for a long time. In 1943, Egyptians and Russians started to build up a bilateral diplomatic relationships. After that, in 1948, there has been an agricultural change between the past two countries. Egypt exported cotton to the Russians, and the Russians, who were considered the Soviet Union at the time, imported wood and grains to Egypt. At President Nasser's era, these relationships started to improve a lot because Russians liked the policy of President Nasser, which was against imperialism. President Nasser was a strong ally to the Russians since they considered him the enemy to the West. The West, who were considered also enemies to the Russians, so they loved President Nasser a lot. Since that time, strong relationships had been built between President Nasser and the Russians in the 50s and 60s of the last century. Russians has always been interested in President Nasser, and they started to build up strong relations with him when they gave him enough money he needed to build the High Dam. The High Dam, which is considered the highest or the biggest dam in the Middle East and in Africa. Russians also helped President Nasser when they set up 97 businesses in Egypt. At the time, it was a huge and a massive project for Egyptians to work in these projects that Russians had helped them. So, and during President Nasser's time, relations between Russians and Egyptians were very, very good. Russians also helped Egyptians during President Nasser's time to build up steel factories in Egypt. Steel factories which were the first steel factories to be built in Egypt at the time. These good relationships during President Nasser's era didn't continue a lot during President Sadat's era because President Sadat was trying to reorient his country towards the West. This policy wasn't liked by Russians. After that, President Mubarak came to rebuild these relations again and try to solve what happened during President Sadat's era. So President Mubarak visited Russia many times in 1979 and 2005, 2001. President Mubarak wanted to rebuild these relations and wanted to benefit from Russia, and they started to cooperate, and he started to cooperate with President Vladimir Putin, the Russian president at the time. President Sisi tried to improve relations with Russians a lot. So in 2014, when he was just a Minister of Defense, in February he visited Russia. At the same year, in August, he also visited Russia again. He tried to build up more strong relations with Russians. Now, Russians has a free zone in the Suez Canal area, which is specified for them. It is the biggest zone for Russians outside Russia in the Middle East and Africa. Russians wanted to invest a lot in this area. Russians also has Al-Daba nuclear reactor, which is being built for peaceful purposes like producing electricity in Egypt. The last question here: who helped Egypt during the last few years? I mean, during the recent era or the recent age, Americans or Russians? I do believe that Russians had helped Egyptians a lot during the last era or during the last few years, during the last 200 years. Russians had helped Egyptians a lot. I mean, Russians during the war with Israel in the 1973, they helped Egyptians in that war. They provided Egyptians with arms, with what they needed from weapons, planes, and the air forces of Egypt were rebuilt, and the whole army of Egypt was rebuilt when Russians helped Egypt to rebuild this army. So Russians helped Egypt during the few years during the last few years when they helped Egypt in the war against Israel, when they helped Egypt to build the High Dam, when they helped Egypt to start its massive projects. Americans, although the Americans give Egypt an aid, which is about $1.3 billion a year, but Americans sometimes use this aid to threaten Egyptians to be their followers, or they will withdraw these aids. Americans threaten Egyptians sometimes to be their allies, to work with them, to follow them at whatever they do, or they will withdraw the aids from Egyptians.